For an embarrassingly long time, I actually walked around genuinely believing that other people held a universal remote control to my brain. Seriously, I thought certain individuals just came equipped with a backdoor access code to my nervous system. All they had to do was drop one specific, perfectly aimed comment, casually graze one of my deepest insecurities, and boom, I would instantly spiral. I'm talking about spending entire evenings trapped in a mental courtroom of my own making. I'd be lying in bed at 2 a.m., staring at the ceiling, fiercely cross-examining their words, and drafting these absolutely brilliant, devastating rebuttals that I knew I would never actually say out loud. All while feeling this heavy, suffocating constriction right in the middle of my chest. I just accepted this as the default human condition. I figured, hey, navigating society simply means handing over chunks of your internal stability to literally anyone you interact with. That's just the tax we pay for doing business as human beings, right? I was completely, fundamentally wrong. In the exact millisecond I finally unraveled the mechanics of this psychological trap, my entire reality was rewritten from the ground up. Because here is the monumental secret that society conveniently forgets to teach us in school. When another human being triggers your rage, they are not actually inflicting anything upon you. You are the architect of your own suffering. And the beautiful part is, once you clearly map out the blueprints of exactly how you construct that anger, you can completely dismantle it. I don't mean burying it deep down so it gives you an ulcer. I don't mean pasting on a fake smile and wearing a mask of artificial, toxic positivity. I mean dismantling it by microscopically observing the exact sequence of events that happens the moment someone manages to pierce your armor. Let's nerd out for a second and break down the actual physics of this. Recall a recent moment when a person profoundly irritated you. Maybe they delivered a super condescending remark in a meeting. Maybe they blatantly ignored something you said. Or maybe they were just radiating pure hostility for absolutely no discernible reason. You felt the physiological cascade, didn't you? Your heart rate accelerated, your jaw locked up, and your brain immediately flooded with the desperate, burning urge to retaliate. But let's pause and ask the most critical question. A question the vast majority of people live their entire 80-something years on this planet without ever asking themselves. What scientifically occurred in that exact fraction of a second? Here is the clinical, boring reality. They expelled air from their lungs. Their vocal cords vibrated. Sound waves traveled through the oxygen in the room and vibrated against your tympanic membrane. Your auditory cortex then translated those vibrations into the English language. That's it. That is the absolute limit of objective reality in that scenario. Just biology and physics. Every single thing that happened next, the boiling indignation, the hot sting of humiliation, the adrenaline-fueled demand to strike back, none of that originated from their mouth. It originated entirely from your own cognitive machinery. It was generated entirely by the narrative you instantly, subconsciously fabricated regarding what those specific sound waves symbolized about you. And right there, my friend, wedged perfectly inside that invisible narrative, lies the entirety of your personal sovereignty. You see, The general population walks around operating on the assumption that emotions are involuntary ambushes. We think an external trigger happens and an internal feeling violently manifests. We treat it like a biological reflex. If your hand brushes against a boiling kettle, your muscles contract and pull away instantly. Ergo, if a colleague disrespects you, your temper flares instantly. Cause and effect, right? But emotional reactivity is not a reflex. There is a hidden, microscopic phase wedged directly in the middle of that equation that almost everyone is totally blind to. That phase is translation. Here is the actual sequence of the human experience. A stimulus occurs in the external world. That is the objective data. Then, your brain instantly assigns a meaning to that data. That is the internal script. Finally, your body generates a chemical emotion that aligns perfectly with your script. That is the ultimate reaction. Most people completely bypass that middle step. They sprint from external data straight to emotional explosion, genuinely convinced they are just helpless victims of their own unpredictable neurochemistry. But you are not helpless. You hold absolute dictatorial authority over that translation phase. And the moment you deeply internalize that concept, the moment it moves from a cool intellectual theory you read on the internet to a lived, breathing experience in your daily life, you become a nearly impenetrable force. Let's look at a highly practical scenario. Imagine two different people walking down a crowded metropolitan sidewalk. Both of them are aggressively, violently bumped by a stranger rushing past, causing them to spill their hot coffee all over their shirts. Pedestrian A's brain immediately writes a script. This stranger is blatantly disrespecting me. They look down on me. They assume I am weak and that they can just bulldoze through my physical space without any consequences. People are always taking advantage of me. Pedestrian B's brain writes a totally different script. Whoa, that person is in a blind panic. They are probably sprinting to the hospital, or they just received some catastrophic news. They didn't even register that I exist. Think about this. It is the exact same objective event. Identical kinetic impact. Identical spilled coffee. Yet pedestrian A spends the next 4 hours vibrating with hostility. They complain to their coworkers, they yell at traffic, and they replay the collision on a mental loop, effectively handing a total stranger the keys to hijack half their day. Pedestrian B? They wipe off their coat, shrug, grab a napkin, and completely delete the encounter from their memory banks within 45 seconds. So I ask you, who was actually steering the emotional wheel there? The stranger who collided with them, or the pedestrians themselves? This is the paradigm shift that alters your entire trajectory. You operate under the illusion that you are reacting to the behavior of others, but you are exclusively reacting to your own assumptions about their behavior. And here is the most uncomfortable truth of all, the one that really stings when you first realize it. The vast majority of the time, the meaning you assign to an event is a reflection of your own internal landscape, not theirs. Someone hurls a sharp critique at you, and you become instantly, fiercely defensive. But why? Usually, it is because in some dark, unexamined corner of your psyche, you suspect their critique might actually be accurate. You secretly fear they have discovered your fatal flaw, and the thought of that exposure is petrifying. So you summon anger. You use rage as a tactical smokescreen to obscure the terrifying possibility that they might actually have a point. But consider the reverse. If you were completely, unshakably rooted in your own self-worth, their critique would simply dissolve into the background static of life. Think about the mechanics of this for a second. If a 4-year-old toddler points a sticky finger at you and calls you a hopeless failure, does your blood pressure spike? Do you lose sleep over it? Of course not. You recognize they lack the cognitive development to assess your worth. You literally assign 0 value to their assessment. It's almost funny. But if a mentor, a boss, or a highly successful peer delivers the exact same phrase, it acts like a dagger straight to the chest. Why the massive difference? Because you voluntarily handed them the psychological knife. You explicitly granted their perception the authority to dictate your self-esteem. And the incredible news is, you can revoke that authorization at any given moment. The brilliant psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl perfectly encapsulated this entire philosophy when he observed, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom." Frankl was not suggesting we engage in toxic positivity. He wasn't advocating for clinical denial or suggesting you pretend catastrophic events are pleasant. He was stating an immutable psychological law. You, and only you, hold the absolute jurisdiction over what is allowed to destabilize your internal sanctuary. You are the sole gatekeeper. Now, a common misinterpretation usually pops up right about here. People assume this means they should evolve into emotionless cyborgs. They think true enlightenment means cultivating a total, frosty apathy toward the opinions of society, just becoming a brick wall. But listen to me, that is not liberation. That is just psychological amputation. Swinging from being chronically hypersensitive to being completely emotionally anesthetized is just trading one prison cell for another. The state of being I am describing is profoundly different. You absolutely retain your humanity. You still possess empathy, preferences, and deep, beautiful emotional capacity. But you are no longer a hostage. You are no longer outsourcing the keys to your central nervous system to random bystanders, desperately crossing your fingers that they handle you with care. You are keeping the keys safely in your own pocket. And that realization fundamentally redesigns your entire posture in the world. Because society has a massive, glaring misunderstanding regarding the utility of anger. We are socially conditioned to view rage as a tactical shield. We falsely believe that if we don't retaliate aggressively when provoked, we are displaying weakness. We think explosive anger is the only thing that prevents us from becoming doormats. The psychological reality is the exact opposite. Visible reactivity is the ultimate proof that an opponent has successfully breached your defenses. Unshakable calmness is the ultimate proof that they haven't even dented the armor. When someone intentionally launches a verbal grenade at you, and you simply observe it detonate at your feet without even flinching, what message does that transmit? It loudly broadcasts that their arsenal is entirely ineffective against you. It signals that you are operating on a frequency they cannot even access. And ironically, quiet, unbothered observation is the most dominant, intimidating posture a human being can possibly assume. To be incredibly clear here, I am not advising you to swallow or suppress valid emotions. Suppression is the act of swallowing a mouthful of poison and trying to convince everyone it tastes like water. You paste on a socially acceptable smile while your organs are internally hemorrhaging. That isn't resilience. That is just a ticking time bomb waiting for a Tuesday afternoon to explode. Nor am I suggesting you passively tolerate abuse. You are absolutely allowed to draw rigid, uncompromising boundaries. You can firmly exit a room. You can terminate a toxic contract. You can cut someone out of your life. But you can execute all of those actions from a baseline of icy, calculated calmness. Sovereign boundary setting is deeply purposeful. Explosive anger is just a sad loss of control. The true mastery lies in not synthesizing the anger to begin with, not through forced numbness, but through absolute, piercing clarity. Because when your vision is perfectly clear, the psychological fuel required to ignite the anger simply vanishes into thin air. So, how do we actually hack this in real life? Let me give you the exact operational framework. Let's say an acquaintance drops a highly passive-aggressive remark into a casual conversation. Instead of allowing your autonomic nervous system to instantly hijack your mouth and spit something back, you install a tiny buffer. You pause. And you ask your higher cognitive functions, is this projection about my flaws? Or is it just a live broadcast of their internal misery? I can assure you with mathematical certainty that 90% of the time you are merely collateral damage in their own internal war. Humans are exceptionally prone to projecting their unhealed trauma, their deep-seated inadequacies, and their chronic dissatisfaction onto whatever target is closest in physical proximity. You just happen to be standing in the blast radius. Once you genuinely comprehend that, not just intellectually in your head, but intuitively in your gut, the indignation evaporates. You realize they aren't actually assassinating your character. They are unconsciously confessing their own pain. And you are under absolutely zero obligation to RSVP to their pity party. Let's look at a corporate environment. We've all been here. A client or a boss replies to your meticulously crafted 20-page proposal with a 3-word email that is just dripping with condescension and dismissiveness. The unevolved version of you immediately takes the bait. Your ego flares up, your face gets hot, you feel professionally humiliated, and you spend the next 3 hours drafting a highly combative, multi-paragraph defense that completely derails your productivity for the day. But the evolved version of you? You insert the buffer. You analyze the data. Perhaps the client is terrified of their own impending budget cuts and needs to assert dominance over a vendor to feel safe. Perhaps they possess a chronic inability to trust others due to past professional betrayals. Or perhaps they are simply having a catastrophically bad morning. Their coffee was cold, their commute was awful, and your email was just the path of least resistance for their frustration. Absolutely none of those variables have anything to do with the objective quality of your proposal. It is entirely about the chaotic state of their nervous system. When you truly grasp that, the desperate instinct to defend your honor vanishes. You don't need to prove your intellectual superiority. You simply observe the behavior like a scientist peering through a microscope. Fascinating. This individual is highly dysregulated today. And then you seamlessly, calmly transition to your next task. That is not passivity. That is supreme psychological dominance. Not the fragile, loud dominance of winning a shouting match, but the impenetrable, quiet dominance of refusing to be dragged into the arena in the first place. And this leads us to an incredibly revealing psychological phenomenon. The specific individuals who manage to consistently trigger you, they are not random. There is a precise algorithmic pattern to your irritation. And if you have the courage to decode that pattern, it will hand you the exact blueprint to your own evolution. The brilliant psychoanalyst Carl Jung famously explored the concept of the shadow, the idea that absolutely everything that irritates us about others can actually lead us to an understanding of ourselves. The person who incites your absolute worst rage is just holding up a high-definition mirror to the exact parts of your own identity that you have not yet reconciled. Consider this. If a detractor accuses you of being incredibly selfish, and your internal temperature skyrockets into a blinding white-hot fury, why does it hit so hard? It is highly probable that you harbor a deep, secret anxiety that you actually are selfish, and their accusation just poured salt directly into an open wound. Conversely, if that same detractor accuses you of being a totally uncreative, rigid conformist, and you genuinely know yourself to be an incredibly innovative artist, their words won't even register. You might actually laugh out loud. Their accusation lacks the necessary psychological hook to snag your insecurities. Therefore, every single time your peace is shattered by an external comment, it is a highly valuable diagnostic tool. It is not providing you with data about the other person. It is providing you with GPS coordinates to your own unhealed terrain. It points directly to the exact location where your self-acceptance is conditional, and where your ego is still desperately standing guard with a spear. This isn't a source of shame. Please don't beat yourself up over it. It is simply a data point. Armed with this data, you can initiate the internal repair. You can interrogate the trigger. Why did that specific phrase destabilize me so badly? What fragile illusion am I currently attempting to guard? What truth am I running from right now? Almost exclusively, the entity you are fiercely protecting is your ego. It is the artificial construct that demands to be perceived as infallible, virtuous, and universally respected. It is the deep-seated fear of being exposed as ordinary, messy, or flawed. These are universal human vulnerabilities. Everyone has them. But it is vital to remember that these vulnerabilities are not you. They are simply transient cognitive weather patterns, and you have the capacity to sit inside the house and watch the storm roll past without stepping out into the freezing rain. The fragile version of your psyche insists that aggression is the only metric of strength. The sovereign version of your psyche understands that aggression is almost always a symptom of panic. True resilience is remaining deeply anchored into the bedrock of your identity while someone actively attempts to capsize your boat. It is choosing a deliberate response over a chaotic reaction. It is silently communicating, simply through the sheer gravity of your unbothered presence, that their manipulation tactics are entirely incompatible with your operating system. Allow me to share a personal recalibration. We all have that one person, right? For years, I had a former close friend who I would occasionally meet for coffee. Without fail, every single interaction was laced with subtle, competitive humblebrags and microscopic, razor-sharp critiques of my lifestyle choices. Historically, these coffee dates were exhausting psychological warfare. I would spend the entire morning mentally arming myself, preloading my own subtle flexes to deploy as counterattacks. I would leave the cafe with my jaw clenched, totally exhausted by the unspoken hostility. Eventually, I decided to run an experiment. I attended our next meeting with a totally revolutionized psychological framework. Instead of viewing this person as a tactical adversary actively attempting to diminish my worth, I viewed them through the lens of profound psychological pain. I recognized that someone who constantly needs to belittle their friends to inflate their own status is living in a perpetual state of screaming inadequacy. I realized their subtle insults were actually cries of deep, unresolved insecurity. When they inevitably dropped their standard condescending remark about my career trajectory, I didn't tense up. I didn't counterattack. I didn't get defensive. I just looked at them with genuine, unforced warmth. Not a patronizing smirk, but a look of authentic human empathy. I simply saw a person trapped in a cage of their own making, entirely unaware of the bars. The insult evaporated before it even reached me. It registered simply as a symptom of their condition, not a verdict on my life. I steered the conversation to a lighter topic and genuinely enjoyed my coffee. That was the exact moment I experienced the epiphany. They possessed zero inherent power over my joy. I had been voluntarily writing them blank checks of my emotional bandwidth for years. And right then and there, I tore up the checkbook. This entire philosophy boils down to the reclamation of your psychological real estate. It is not about asserting dominance over your environment. It is about establishing a total monopoly over your internal state. The vast majority of the global population is sleepwalking. They are marionettes, completely tethered to the whims of their environment. A stranger cuts them off in traffic, their string gets pulled, and they perform the anger dance. A colleague issues a compliment, a different string gets pulled, and they perform the joy dance. They live their entire lives completely oblivious to the fact that they are holding the very scissors required to cut the strings. But the simple fact that you are processing these words right now indicates that a deeper part of your consciousness recognizes an alternative route. And that route begins exclusively with hyper-awareness. It requires catching the ignition sequence before the engine fires. It means noticing the physiological shift, that familiar tightening in the stomach, the sudden flush of heat in the back of your neck, the exact second the external trigger occurs. And in that microscopic window, instead of throwing gasoline on the spark, you step back and become an impartial observer. You refuse to judge the feeling. You refuse to frantically suppress it. You just watch it. Fascinating. My body is currently generating the neurochemistry of defensiveness. Then you deploy the diagnostic question. What fragile part of my identity needs guarding right now? Usually, it is the ego demanding to be validated as correct or superior. And while that demand is entirely natural, it is also completely artificial. The ego is just a collection of historical survival mechanisms. It is not the core of who you actually are. And survival mechanisms can be updated. There is a brilliant psychological principle that suggests unresolved anger is essentially just unacknowledged pain frantically searching for an external scapegoat. The exact moment you turn the spotlight of your own awareness onto that pain, the anger is starved of its oxygen. Anger requires absolute unconsciousness to thrive. It demands that you operate on pure, unthinking autopilot. The second you introduce deliberate observation, the anger is forced to justify its own existence, and under the microscope of logic, it rarely can. You quickly realize that this specific conflict is fundamentally a poor investment of your limited biological energy. This passing stranger is not worth sacrificing your Tuesday afternoon for. And so you simply open your hands and let the grievance drop to the floor. Not out of passive submission, but out of elite resource management. Now, a very valid counterargument frequently arises here, and I want to address it. What happens when a boundary is legitimately violated? What if the disrespect is undeniable and severe? Do I just sit there and meditate while I am being professionally or personally attacked? Absolutely not. But you do not have to surrender your internal equilibrium to address it. You need to understand the vast chasm between a reactive explosion and a sovereign response. The reactive explosion looks like this. A boundary is crossed. Your amygdala takes the wheel. You match their aggressive frequency. You scream, you insult, you type out a furious, career-ending email. You artificially inflate the drama. The aftermath? You are biologically exhausted. Your reputation is damaged, and the original issue remains entirely unsolved. The sovereign response looks like this. A boundary is crossed. You register the violation. You feel the biological surge of adrenaline urging you to attack. But you deny it access to your vocal cords. You impose the physical pause. You ensure your breathing is slow and your heart rate is managed. And then, from a fortress of absolute clarity, you execute your maneuver. Perhaps you calmly state that the conversation is over and exit the room. Perhaps you clearly articulate the professional consequences of their behavior. Perhaps you permanently sever the relationship. But whatever tactical choice you make, it is generated by cold, calculated intention, not hot, chaotic impulse. You remain the undisputed author of your actions. You utilize the emotion as a dashboard indicator, a warning light that a boundary has been breached. But you do not let the warning light steer the vehicle. This is the ultimate distinction between being a victim of your emotions and being the master of them. And the ripple effects of this mastery are genuinely spectacular. Because when you permanently disconnect your reactivity, the manipulators and the energy vampires in your orbit experience a catastrophic system failure. These individuals rely entirely on the predictable physics of provocation. They push a button to extract your emotional reaction because your chaos makes them feel significant and powerful. When you stare back at them with unbothered, tranquil silence, you strip them of all their power. It's like unplugging their machine from the wall. Faced with a non-reactive wall, they will typically choose one of two paths. They will either frantically escalate their behavior in a desperate attempt to locate a new trigger, or they will completely retreat because the psychological return on investment has dropped to zero. In either scenario, you emerge victorious, because the only metric of victory that actually matters is the preservation of your internal peace. Your psychological tranquility is infinitely more valuable than securing the last word. It is vastly more expensive than the cheap thrill of winning a petty argument. It is worth more than any insult they could ever conjure. When this concept truly clicked for me, the psychological weight I shed was unimaginable. I completely terminated my desperate hunger to be universally understood. I abandoned the exhausting, lifelong campaign to secure everyone's approval. I realized that whether an external entity perfectly comprehends my motives or completely misinterprets them, the internal architecture of my identity remains totally unchanged. I am exactly the same biological and psychological entity, regardless of their applause or their condemnation. And the moment you stop begging the world for permission to feel secure, you discover absolute freedom. You are free to construct your life without drafting endless apologies. You are free to establish your values without requiring a consensus from the peanut gallery. And ironically, the universe possesses a bizarre sense of humor. The exact moment you stop desperately performing to secure respect, people naturally begin to respect you. The moment you stop begging to be understood, your actions become undeniably clear. When you stop chasing validation, you finally become capable of validating yourself. This posture is frequently mistaken for arrogance or clinical detachment. It is neither. It is simply profound structural integrity. It is the quiet confidence of knowing exactly who you are and understanding that the projections of other humans are just that, projections. They are shifting shadows on a wall, not structural facts. The crowd that idolizes you on a Tuesday is perfectly capable of crucifying you on a Thursday. If you anchor your stability to their fluctuating opinions, you will live your entire life in a state of severe motion sickness. But if you anchor your stability deep within your own core, the external weather simply ceases to matter. So how do you operationalize this philosophy? How do you transition from a highly reactive organism into a sovereign observer? It is not a magical software update. You can't just download it. It is a grueling, repetitive cognitive workout, and it begins with the smallest possible increment. The next time you encounter a microscopic friction point, a rude barista, a slow driver cutting you off, a passive-aggressive text message from a relative, run this drill. Deny the immediate reaction. Enforce a mandatory 3-second holding period. Count it out in your head. 1, 2, 3. Within that tiny gap in time, ask yourself the diagnostic question: is this behavior actually about me, or is it a broadcast of their internal state? The vast majority of the time, the logic will clearly indicate it is entirely about them. That sheer logical realization will instantly neutralize 80% of the venom. For the remaining 20%, you employ conscious release. You literally articulate to your own brain, I am actively choosing not to fund this grievance with my energy. And then you direct your focus elsewhere. Run this drill one time today, just once. You will not achieve sudden nirvana. The heavens will not part and angels won't sing. But you will experience a very subtle, profoundly empowering micro-victory. You will experience a fleeting moment of, wow, I actually had the option to spiral into rage right there, and I simply chose not to. That microscopic gap is the birthplace of your freedom. Execute the drill again tomorrow and the day after. Through neuroplasticity, this deliberate pause will gradually fuse into an automatic neurological pathway. The agonizing effort of holding back your reaction will slowly morph into a natural, default state of unbothered observation. You will eventually navigate high-stress environments that used to reduce you to ashes, and you will do so with a resting heart rate. People in your periphery will be baffled by your equilibrium. They will ask you what your secret is. And you will internally smile, remembering the era when your emotional state was at the mercy of every passing comment. You will realize the staggering distance you have traveled, not because you built thicker armor, but because you finally understood that the battlefield itself was an illusion. You will have mastered the fundamental truth. Rage is an elective choice. Serenity is an elective choice. And you simply developed the supreme discipline to choose serenity repeatedly under pressure. Make no mistake, your ego will violently resist this transition. Your pride operates like a faulty, hypersensitive car alarm system, constantly screaming that if you do not retaliate, you are weak. It will try to convince you that vengeance is a requirement for survival. But your ego is a terrible strategist. The ego prioritizes the illusion of victory over the reality of happiness. The ego prefers to win the argument, even if it means burning down the house to do it. But the core of your consciousness, the authentic you, desires something infinitely more valuable. You desire absolute clarity. You desire to navigate the chaos of human existence without the chaos infiltrating your bloodstream. Some philosophers refer to this state as detachment, but I find that term way too sterile. True non-reactivity isn't cold. It is the ultimate form of warmth. Because when you are no longer blindly reacting to the insults of others, you finally possess the visual clarity to see their underlying wounds. You stop seeing a malicious adversary, and you start seeing a terrified, insecure human being flailing in the dark. Instead of reacting to their toxic behavior, you find yourself responding to their fragile humanity. That is the definition of genuine compassion. It is the profound recognition that every single person walking this earth is fighting a brutal, invisible war that you know absolutely nothing about. They are operating with damaged equipment, doing the absolute best they can to simply survive their own minds. When you truly integrate that perspective, taking offense becomes almost impossible. You realize they aren't actively hunting you. They are just wildly firing shots in the dark, hoping to hit anything that makes them feel less alone. And that empathy is the final key that unlocks the door. It liberates you from the exhausting cycle of taking everything personally. Because ultimately, you must remember this absolute truth. You are the infinite sky, and your emotions are simply the weather patterns passing through. A thunderstorm can be violent, loud, and chaotic, but it has absolutely no ability to permanently damage the sky. It just passes. You are the silent awareness that observes the storm. Within that deep, unshakable awareness, you can never be truly harmed, because awareness is not constructed of anything that can be broken. It is perpetually calm. It is perpetually clear. That is your genuine identity. You are not the fragile ego desperately guarding its reputation. You are the impenetrable calm residing at the exact center of the storm. And the deeper you anchor yourself into that center, the more the illusion of external control shatters. No coworker, no former friend, no insulting text message possesses the atomic power to dictate your reality. Because their weapons only exist in the external world, and you are operating from the fortress of the internal world. So, when the next inevitable provocation occurs, remember your architecture. Remember that they cannot force you to feel anything. They can only offer you a script, and you hold the absolute, undeniable right to refuse to read it. You can draft an entirely different script, a script where their hostility is a reflection of their own storm, a script where your peace is strictly non-negotiable. That option is perpetually available, waiting for you to select it. And with every single selection, your internal gravity grows stronger. The external world will not magically soften. The traffic will still be terrible. Critics will still be loud, and the chaos will persist. But you will have fundamentally altered your relationship to the chaos. Everything transforms, not because the world was magically fixed, but because your lens was completely wiped clean. That is the ultimate objective. And if you have absorbed these concepts, you are already standing on the threshold. You are fully equipped to stop renting out your nervous system to the highest bidder. You are ready to reclaim your sovereignty. Execute this reclamation immediately. Let the next provocation strike the wall and fall harmlessly to the floor. Not because you engaged in a desperate fight to block it, but because there was nothing there for it to hook onto, just vast, unshakable clarity. And within that clarity, you will finally unearth the exact thing you have been frantically searching the external world to find. Total, unconditional sanctuary. Not the fragile sanctuary that relies on a perfectly controlled environment, but the permanent sanctuary that thrives regardless of the weather. The sanctuary that was always inside you, waiting patiently for you to stop fighting shadows and finally step out of the rain. Welcome home.